Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Proactive Monitoring and Logging, a webinar by LMG Security. My name is Natalie Bray, and I am your moderator for today. Our presenter for the webinar today is Matt Duran. Matt Duran is the Director of Training and Research at LMG Security and a senior consultant with the organization. He is an instructor at International Black Hat USA Conference, where he taught classes on ransomware and data breaches. Matt has conducted cybersecurity seminars, tabletop exercises, and classes for thousands of attendees in all sectors, including banking, retail, healthcare, government, and more. A seasoned cybersecurity and IT professional, Matt specializes in ransomware response and research, as well as deployment of proactive cybersecurity solutions. Matt holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Montana, and his malware research has been featured on NBC Nightly News. Matt, I am passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today for our proactive monitoring and logging webinar. Honestly, this is one of my favorite webinars to deliver, mainly because we get to really break down what an effective monitoring solution looks like for a generalized organization, and we get to provide a lot of tips and tricks along the way that we've picked up during our days in incident response as kind of the nice-to-have items or the essential items in some cases that we'd like to have available in the case that there is a cybersecurity incident. We'll also go through how you can use these kind of systems to detect incidents early and stop yourself from becoming a victim of one of these incidents in the first place. Very important piece of kit to have available to you. But before we get into that, I wanted to point out something that went a little bit overlooked in the news over this last couple of months, and that was a brand new record. So if you track cybersecurity news, you might have spotted this, but there is a new botnet that is making its way through the world right now called the Mantis botnet, and this is targeting servers and hypervisors specifically. Cloudflare, just a couple of months ago, had to mitigate what was, in fact, a world record for a distributed denial of service attack. So this is an attack against an exposed web surface, a web server, a payment processing system, or something that has availability on the public internet that will completely drop things offline. This botnet was capable of delivering over 212 million HTTPS requests every 30 seconds, and this was done using about 5,000 infected devices. Now, to break down why that is such a notable increase in efficiency for something like this. If we flash backwards to 2016 when the attacks against DIN happened. DIN was a DNS provider, and they were taken offline for about a day, which essentially crippled the internet for an entire day. There were large-scale services like Amazon and Google that were not able to function properly. The botnet that was behind that was called the Mirai botnet, and this was about 100,000 compromised devices, which were capable of operating at about 1/4 of the efficiency of this botnet. So we can see that the availability and the efficiency of these botnets are going way up. The number of devices they have to have compromised are going way down. And this is something that we're going to see as a problem moving forward, especially going after critical infrastructure like servers and your virtual machine controllers or your hypervisors. Now, why do I bring that up in a presentation about monitoring and logging? Well, the answer is these become problems. These botnets and these low lurking pieces of malware become problems because they remain undetected for a very, very long time. And the Mantis botnet is no exception to this. What we really want to do is point out why monitoring can be used to very effectively capture information about these kind of threats before they become such a big deal, and what they can be, or how they can be leveraged to really improve your overall network security. We want to be able to identify high-risk user behavior. We want to be able to detect threats quickly. So this is before malware takes your network over, before your information is out the door to a file sharing server on the other side of the planet, before your resources are abused for things like crypto mining or for inclusion in a botnet, and before ransomware is deployed, some giant, very catastrophic type of cyber attack. This also allows you to respond very quickly and to be prepared if there is the need for an investigation after a cybersecurity incident occurs. Now, for today's roadmap, we're going to go over a couple of very important things. We're going to cover monitoring and logging fundamentals, some of those critical items that you should be looking at, either maintaining or recording inside of your environment, not just for the purposes of defeating a cyber attack, but also because they can help with overall network health and troubleshooting in general. We're going to talk about detecting incidents early and how proper monitoring setup can be used can be leveraged to do that. We're going to go over sources of logs and evidence, where we find this information and how we should be storing it. We'll go over centralized collection and cloud visibility, because cloud logs and cloud information is a much different animal than local system information, and there are some special considerations that we need to have in play for that. And then we'll go over a quick checklist at the very end on monitoring and logging. So before we really get into too many of the fundamentals here, I want to give you an example of a case where logging would have been very beneficial. This was a manufacturing company that we worked with a few months back, and they had received a few reports from clients about not receiving payments that had been emailed to them over the course of about 6 or 7 months. There was also reports of some strange email activity from members of their finance department, and a couple of clients actually reported receiving phishing emails from more than one staff member within this organization. So we can kind of get an idea for what the potential compromise might look like and what might be the appropriate remediation actions here. So what actually happened in this case? Well, this was a case of business email compromise. By the numbers, this is a more financially devastating type of cybercrime than ransomware every year, but it does not get the same media attention or publication attention because it's not as flashy of a topic. Also, a lot of times business email compromise cases tend to go unreported. If it is a large-scale financial fraud that doesn't potentially expose personal data, then there's a good chance that's not going to make the main news cycles. And we're not really going to be as aware of this as a large-scale problem as we are with something like ransomware. Looking into the system a little bit further, we found indicators of malware on a bunch of their local computer systems. They had 6 total compromised email accounts, and over the 6-month period where we had available log data, there were 11 intercepted payments that we were able to identify. Now, that seems like a lot, and it is. But the reason that this was able to fly so far under the radar was mainly because during that 6-month period, 8 of the 11 intercepted transactions that we saw were less than $2,000. And based on some departmental turnover and some other issues inside of the victim organization, they had essentially chalked those up to mistakes on their employee side, not realizing that these had been intercepted by a criminal who had access to their email system. It wasn't until the very end, the last 2 weeks of the infection period, when 3 large-scale transactions were intercepted back to back to back, that it really became evident that there was something bad going on in that email tenant. And overall, the losses were about $150,000 for this one particular organization. That's significant, especially for a smaller organization. 150 grand is not something that you can just easily write off on your books. That's going to have an impact on your overall operations. So when we get into the overall investigation, there's a few questions that we have to answer. And most of the time, the questions are the same, but the answers come out different depending on our environment and what we have available to actually use for the investigation. We want to know how they got in. We want to know, do they still have access? We would like to know what data was stolen, or if data was stolen in the first place. And then we need to look at what laws, regulations, or contracts may potentially relate to this, if there's notifications that need to be sent out, or if there's any other kind of regulatory actions that need to be taken. Now, in this case, we ran into a couple of roadblocks in the investigation based on what we had available to really get to the bottom of what happened inside the network. The network itself was a mix of company-issued laptops and personal devices. So we had tablets and smartphones to contend with that were not maintained under an overarching device policy and were not being actively monitored by this organization's IT and security staff. We also had no centralized log storage. We were really relegated to what we could find on the local systems inside of this environment. They had basic antivirus running, so just Windows Defender only, no additional components on top of that, including an endpoint detection and response system, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, intrusion prevention system, detection system, XDR, or anything like that. We were really looking at just built-in antivirus. And then their email tenant was a mix of E1 and E3 licenses for Office 365. And when we get into talking about retention times for cloud services, we'll talk about why that became such a big issue. So first off, we wanted to look at the local system and see what we could find, what kind of information we could pull off of their local computers to determine what types of activities were going on, if someone still had access to the network, and if there was a more malicious component than what we had already kind of identified. The very first place that we're always going to look for something like that is our workstation and server logs. And in a Windows environment, these are unfortunately sometimes the only pieces of network evidence or physical evidence that we'll be able to pull back from these systems that actually tells us anything useful. The example you see in front of you is an event that indicates a successful network logon. That's event ID 4624. That's one of the ones you should absolutely be watching. And this one particularly is showing an interactive login over the network. So this is someone logging in with remote desktop protocol or something else along those lines. Windows event logs should be saved, or at least parts of them should be saved. You don't need to pull the entirety of the event logs out of every single computer in your environment, but there are some critical elements that we can pull out into a centralized piece of storage and maintain for a while that will be very beneficial. These can tell you things like remote authentication events, or remote desktop folder, remote desktop access or shared folder access. It can tell you when new scheduled tasks are being created. It can look for evidence of privilege escalation, so somebody moving from a standard account up to an administrator level account. It can show us operating system errors and a lot more. What it can't tell you is equally important, though. When we're looking at just local system log data, there's a lot of instances where we won't be able to determine if data was exfiltrated, as an example. We don't really get any indications of network traffic, and there are a lot of malware indicators that don't propagate inside of those normal system event logs. We need to have other sources of data available to us to really be able to determine whether or not something is still active inside the network. So getting started, there are a few events when we're looking at local logs that should be maintained for a period of, we normally recommend at least a year. Longer if you have the available hard drive space for it. But these are going to be security event IDs 4624, which is a successful network authentication, security event ID 4625, which is a failed authentication. This can be useful for determining if there is the potential for brute force password guessing attacks going on, or other suspicious activity like that. It's also worth pointing out that these particular events, the failed authentications, are not logged by default in most Windows operating systems. This is something that you have to turn on either by a group policy or manually through the logging configuration on each host individually. We also want to look at account logons with explicit credentials. That's a security event ID 4648. That will tell us if somebody is moving from the account they're currently logged in with up to an account with potentially higher privilege. So if they're running something as an administrator, we'll have an event generated like this. We have scheduled task creation, which is a big persistence piece of methodology that a lot of cybercriminals will use. And then we have terminal services, so remote desktop specifically. Now, there's a bunch more elements of the Windows Event Log system that you should be logging besides just these 5, but this is a great way to get started. If you'd like a little bit more information, let me know. I've got a one sheet on kind of the big hitter Windows Event IDs that we look for during an investigation, and I'm happy to provide that to you. Now, luckily, this is not a difficult thing to do. There's an app for collecting these log elements and sending them off to a centralized server. And a lot of them are either free or very, very low cost. There is a built-in Windows Event Log forwarder that comes from Microsoft directly. This can be used for sending off to a Syslog server or a SIEM. SolarWinds has a great event log forwarder. Snare has a really effective forwarder. Sumo Logic has a really nice one. There are a ton of options out there for you to be able to use. And again, most of these are either fully free to use or they are very, very low cost. We also need to know where this data is going to be stored. How are we actually going to maintain this information? And how are we going to access it later if we do end up needing it for something? And for a lot of organizations, the go-to answer for that is going to be a Syslog server. So if you don't have a Syslog server in your environment already and you have some spare hardware laying around, you can actually put one of these together for either no cost if you have everything already in play, or very low cost if you need to order a little bit of extra hardware. But Syslog servers are very effective. They can help you store and categorize your log data from multiple sources. Doesn't have to be just Windows event logs. We can display and visualize events that are happening, which makes data analytics very, very simple and very quick. We can identify potential network issues, spot early attack indicators, which again is really what we want to get out of our monitoring setup at this point. And these are supported natively by most of the Unix-based operating systems. There are also utilities available for Windows for turning pretty much any Windows operating system into a SIEM or into a Syslog server. Now, event logs aren't the only thing that we want to be keeping out of a local environment, not by any stretch of the imagination. We want to get pretty much anything we can. And luckily, if we have that central repository, we can pipe all that data over pretty easily. We're talking about things like antivirus and security software logs. We want logs from our business applications. We want peripheral devices, routers, firewalls, Internet of Things devices, so security cameras, phone systems, anything else, and really anything else that could generate this kind of actionable data for us. Okay, so knowing that, going back to the investigation, again, we were limited to what was stored on local computers and servers only, and failed logons were not recorded in this set of log data. We had some Windows Defender alerts that showed warnings for potentially malicious software on the network, but no actual blocks in place. So that leads us to one of those very fundamental questions that we have to ask. Were the attackers still in the network? And we suspected yes, but we didn't really have any visibility, so we had to deploy some software to actually get a look at what was happening in the network. We suspected yes, they were still in the network because in most cases, adversaries stay in your network for quite a while. And this was a concept that we refer to as dwell time. Now, luckily, this time has dropped a little bit over the last year or so. This is a report that was put out by Mandiant just earlier this year. And we saw a median dwell time in cybersecurity incidents of about 21 days for the year 2021. So we have about 3 weeks from when an attacker actually gains access to your network to when they kind of do their grand finale at the end of the event, their ransomware detonation, their file exfiltration, something along those lines. But we have about 3 weeks that we can detect their presence before anything like this actually happens. Now, I want to break that down just a little bit when we're talking about that 3-week figure. For the most part, attackers are really going to be inside of about 8 to 14 days. That's where we see the vast majority of cyber criminals acting as their dwelling time in the network. However, if we look a little bit farther down the chain, we see a spike in dwell time between 90 and 300 days that is significant. This is right about 10 to 12% of all attacks. And this can last for quite a while. So what attackers are doing during this period of time is fairly straightforward. They are expanding their footprint inside the network. They're really establishing persistence so they can regain access if one of their access methods is cut off. They're researching your organization, and they're getting ready to steal data. Now, when we're talking about coming up with ways to stop this in that initial dwell time, we really need to talk about a concept called the pyramid of pain. And this is one of the kind of fundamental elements of a logging and monitoring program, especially if you're focusing more on proactive threat hunting and proactive security, that really just needs to be kind of understood. So the pyramid of pain is a great breakdown on 2 things. It is how hard a particular element of a cyber attack is for a hunter or security pro to identify, and how hard it is for an adversary to change that tactic if they are identified. If we're talking about something like malware on a network, something like a botnet or just a general piece of information stealing malware, one of the things that we can look at is network traffic. Again, this is one of those very easy things for us to identify if we have the proper monitoring infrastructure in place. What you see in front of you is a capture of the TrickBot botnet that we ran out of LMG's malware lab, and we are illustrating what we call a heartbeat. This is a periodic communication that occurs from the malware inside your network out to what's called a command and control server, or a C2 server. You may see it referred to that way. But really what this malware is doing is reaching out and asking for instructions on what it should do next. These are very small pieces of data. This is not very intensive for the computer that's infected. And it's almost unnoticeable from a performance aspect. What we really need to have is network visibility at this point, or at the very least behavioral visibility on the computer that we're looking at. Otherwise, if we don't have that in place, there is not going to be any direct indicator that something is wrong with the computer. We're not going to see a performance slowdown. We're not going to see weird pop-ups or anything like that. This is just going to be silently running in the background until such time as it receives instructions to do something else. And by the time we hit that point, it's kind of too late to really do anything proactive about it. We're really into the reactive stage at that point. The way that we identify these things ahead of time, we used to recommend large-scale network monitoring setups, but really what we kind of lean into now is the inclusion of next-gen antivirus and endpoint detection and response software, or EDR software. There are several great options out there for your organization, depending on your budget, your size, and your needs. The ones that we normally see the most in the wild are going to be offerings like Carbon Black or CrowdStrike Falcon or SentinelOne. All these are very great solutions, and they include a lot of security tools that are very useful for, one, identifying if something like this is happening on your network, and then remediating kind of all in one fell swoop. They can also be automated very well. But they do things like signature detection, like we would associate with traditional antivirus, and behavioral detection. So if we see something like those periodic pings out to a known bad server, our EDR software is likely going to be able to identify either the program that's doing that or the traffic behind it, and give us a great way to stop that in its track. We also get historical log collection, which is really nice. So I want to lean in just for a second on EDR specifically. And the reason I do this is EDR is kind of becoming the go-to when it comes to our main security toolkit that we need to have deployed to be able to really identify problems inside the network. These are usually host-based applications. They do real-time continuous monitoring, live response, which is really nice if we see something in the network that we want to take care of right away. In a lot of cases with offerings like CrowdStrike or Carbon Black, we can isolate hosts off the system so nothing can spread. And all of this, again, can be very heavily automated and relies very heavily on artificial intelligence. Now, when we're talking about the difference between EDR and antivirus, it's a question that comes up fairly frequently. What is the main difference between them? And really, we see EDR as kind of the next generation of antivirus and security software. They are not the same by any means, but a lot of new EDR offerings will contain antivirus elements. So instead of just being used for behavioral detection, they can also do that signature detection that we've really come to associate with traditional security scanning software. Realistically, if you have the opportunity to go for both, go for both. You want to have both of these elements in your system for a layered approach to your security. We don't want to be relying on just one specific piece. The other reason you may want to consider having this in your network is a good number of cyber insurance organizations are beginning to require these types of elements in your network for the purposes of renewal and for getting a policy in the first place. They'll be looking at things like your multi-factor two-factor authentication configuration, your available EDR software, and other configuration items that are really essential for maintaining the overall security of a network. And again, there are some great low-cost solutions out there if cost is a concern for you. There are also some very, very high-functioning pieces out there if your staff is potentially not either available or trained for operating. This can be automated heavily, and then can also be monitored 24/7 by an outside organization, which we'll get into a little bit more here as we move through. All right, so EDR software and antivirus software can cover most of those first 5 elements of the pyramid. So your tools, your network artifacts, domains, IP addresses, and hash values. But what about tactics, techniques, and procedures? That very top triangle, those TTPs that you always hear security professionals talking about. What do we do for those? It can be tough to identify a tactic. By identifying a tool or a piece of software, well, that can be done pretty easily, but identifying behavior becomes a little bit more difficult. What we recommend there is conducting threat hunting, and this can usually be done with your EDR software if it is properly deployed and configured inside your environment. I have included here a screenshot of the CrowdStrike Falcon dashboard. This is one that we use very heavily in our incident response offerings. A great piece of software if you've never taken a look at it. But what you see here is the actual execution chain of a spam document being executed from email. This is somebody clicking on a document, opening the document, clicking enable content, and potentially infecting themselves with some malware. And we can follow it through the chain and set blocks up at each one of these individual steps. So we see when Word opening, this is Microsoft Word, so just a regular Word document. Once that document opens, it invokes PowerShell. PowerShell then invokes the command prompt, and we see a bunch of other pieces of our internal system software start to be invoked at that point. So that execution chain by itself, if we can identify that, can stop a lot of potential infections in our network in their tracks, something that we definitely want to have in place. Okay, so enough about that. Back into our investigation, we did find a lurking threat once we had visibility into the network. There was a remote access Trojan called Qbot that we identified on multiple workstations inside the environment. This was likely delivered by a spam email to start with and then spread laterally through the network from there. We had indicators of malicious activity going back at least 6 months inside this network. We didn't have visibility past 6 months, so it's very possible that it was a much longer standing problem, but we couldn't really verify after that point. Really what this comes down to is this could have been detected much, much earlier and could have been a much less significant problem for this organization. Monitoring and threat hunting, if properly configured and deployed, could have identified that suspicious activity during that 6-month dwell time that the attackers had. It could have alerted to any lateral spread that was going on inside the network. It could have identified and blocked any new malware infections, and it could have verified if any data was stolen, because in this case, we didn't really have any indications that data had gone out the door, but we also couldn't prove that it didn't, which put us in kind of a bad situation. Now, when we're talking about this kind of monitoring, having your endpoint detection and response software in place, having your monitoring system set up is great, but you do need to have someone who actually has eyes on this, at least periodically. If we're just maintaining this data in the back end and we're not actually doing anything with it, we're just wasting hard drive space, and we're kind of wasting time and effort by having that system available. And we're also wasting a really good opportunity for some really actionable data about our network. But one thing we need to consider is whether or not we want to include a 24-hour monitoring organization. A lot of EDR and antivirus and security software vendors like CrowdStrike will offer what they call MDR, or Managed Detection and Response Services. And essentially what this is basically a built-in SOC. It is a security operations center that can look at the readings that are coming off of your software and let you know proactively if something is popping up that is outside of what normal behavior looks like inside your network. This can be especially effective on things like weekends and holidays, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. This also could augment your current staff. If you have IT and security staff that are both kind of pegged as far as their workloads go inside your network, which is not an uncommon scenario, this can really take a lot of the pressure off of them and allow them to focus more on their critical job duties and less on security monitoring until it becomes, well, basically essential for them to do that. There's also specialized skills and tools that these external monitoring organizations will have that can be a great benefit to you. And a lot of times they are actually cheaper than bringing on another full-time employee, so something to keep in mind. We also need to talk about how the response to things is basically assigned once we do get that notification that something wrong is happening in the network. We want to be able to evaluate alerts quickly and then triage, determine urgency and what our next steps are going to look like, who is going to be responsible for those, and whether or not we need to escalate up to another portion of our security infrastructure or our incident response team. This can also go for greatly assist with quick containment by first responders, and it can assist us when we need to call in external assets for more widespread support. Now, if this is something that you're at all interested in and don't have a lot of background on, we actually offer a cyber first responder class with LMG, and we do practical response and training. So ransomware, cloud, malware, detonations, and a lot more. We talk about where to find these essential pieces of information, how to preserve them correctly, and how you can leverage these kind of tactics to, again, greatly improve your organizational security. If you're interested, we have a registration deadline of tomorrow for a class we're doing on July 28th, but we do run this fairly frequently. And Beasley Insureds get a 10% discount. So, all right, enough self-promotion on that part. One of the things that we want to really get out of this is having an on-call process. So how is your staff actually notified if your logging and monitoring infrastructure picks up something wrong inside of your network? This is a study that was done by FireEye last year, and from FireEye's determinations, about 76% of malicious detonations happen outside of standard work hours. This is evenings, weekends, holidays, and times when you don't necessarily have your staff in place to be able to quickly respond to these kind of incidents. Having someone who is watching your back when you're not there, who can alert you if something is going wrong and can potentially take those initial steps to isolate a potentially malicious infection on your system, can be invaluable when it comes to overall network security. So again, something we highly recommend. Okay, so we talked about what happens when we don't have log data. So let's do a counterpoint to that and run through a case study of an instance where we did actually have very good logging and monitoring data and what we were able to do differently during that kind of an engagement. So in this case, we're going to use a hacked web server. The organization was that we were working with as an e-commerce organization. They had a sales site that was available to the public internet, and they ran into a potential problem with their overall web server. The contents of the server were not things that we wanted to get out there onto the public internet. So this was names, addresses, dates of birth, payment information, and a lot more. The reason that they called us was because they got some indications from an EDR system they had running on their network that there was malicious activity on the server. So we jumped in to actually do a full investigation and figure out what happened. As it turned out, there was a vulnerability on the web server that had not been patched, and an attacker was able to leverage that vulnerability to put a web shell in place and establish persistent access to that server. They had full access to everything that server was connected to, and they had full access to the root operating system as well. There was potential for data exposure here, which is why we wanted to move in and do a little bit deeper of an investigation. So again, let's go over our questions. How exactly did they get in? Do they still have access? Did they move laterally to other elements of the network? Did they gain access to a sensitive database? Was data stolen? And then again, what laws, regulations, or contracts relate? So when we get into these kind of investigations, the very first thing we have to do is, well, an investigation. So we call this, ironically, the investigation before the investigation. What log data is available? Where is it stored? What's our retention time look like? And how is this log data accessible? In this case, the victim organization had a SIEM setup. This is a security information and event management system. Very similar to what we would expect from a Syslog server, but a lot more advanced in terms of what you're able to do with it. This can, again, aggregate data from multiple sources throughout the network. So we're talking about firewalls, servers, switches and routers, intrusion detection systems, and everything else. And then other types of evidence from local systems, so event logs and a lot of the other critical local system elements that we talked about right at the very beginning. Again, all of these can be conglomerated into one singular space, and it makes analysis of this data a lot easier. They also had an intrusion detection system available, and intrusion detection systems, as a very baseline piece of security software, can be very, very handy. Now, these alert when something bad occurs on your network. They don't necessarily stop it, but they do alert you to the fact that something bad is happening. And there are multiple types that are available. So there are network-based, there are host-based, there are SaaS-based intrusion detection systems, and a lot more. The one that will work the best for your environment really depends on what your environment is kind of constructed like, what types of services you use, and what kind of applications you really rely on. There are also some really great open source options for intrusion detection systems. Suricata, Zeek, and Snort are three that are commonly brought up, can be very effective, and again, can be very cost effective for your environment. So in this case, using something like an IDS system, we would be looking for an alert, especially for something like database activity. Luckily for us, we did not find anything, so that was great news. Good start to the investigation. The logging configuration for the overall victim organization was very good, though. They had a lot of historical data and a lot of very easy access to that data that we were able to jump into and almost immediately leverage. They had internet information service logs that went back 12 months and were all stored off-site. They had flow records also maintained for 12 months, all stored off-site. They had CrowdStrike already in place on the network, and so we had a virtual dashboard that gave us full network visibility that we could log into almost immediately. And all firewall and workstation logs were piped up and stored inside of Sumo Logic, which is a cloud SIEM provider. And they do a great job of, again, putting everything into a nice package that can be very easily leveraged for an investigation. Now, I bring up flow records in here specifically because flow records are one of those pieces of information that we always ask for when we start into an investigation, but very seldom receive. And that's unfortunate because there's a lot of really great information, not just for security purposes, but also for just general network troubleshooting that you can pull from flow record data. So flow records include things like the source, destination address of network traffic, the type of traffic, the volume of data that was passed back and forth, the direction of that transfer, and it's already generated by a lot of your network equipment and just maintained on that piece of network equipment. The problem there is that it rolls over very quickly because those pieces of hardware are not designed to basically store log data for a really long time. We want to be piping that off to another source. It's very easy to do, but in a lot of cases, it's just simply not being done, either because the IT staff doesn't know it's there, or they've just never had time to set the system up. In this case, what we were going to be looking for was the potential for data exfiltration, outbound traffic to a malicious IP address. And again, lucky for us, we didn't find anything in the available log data. And since it was comprehensive, we could take that as a very good indicator that we weren't really dealing with a heavy data exfiltration situation. The other thing they had in place was a web proxy. And this, again, is one of those really nice pieces of information you can pull from your network that is very easy and cost-effective to set up, that is just flat not included in a lot of security setups. Web proxies can be used to record user internet activity. They can be used to control access to potentially malicious websites. And there's a lot of information, again, that we can pull back. Dates, times, and URLs of web surfing. We can get cached web pages and images or files that were downloaded. Again, a lot of information available right at our fingertips. In this case, we were looking for something like a connection to a file upload service, which, again, we did not find. Great news there. So key results from this, because we had so much information on the network, were very promising, and we were able to provide a very, very detailed summary of what happened during the period of compromise that the victim in this case was able to use to rule out a data breach, which was great news. We knew based on the information we had that the adversary had attempted to extract credentials from the web server using Kiwi. Kiwi is a newer version of a piece of malicious software called Mimikatz. We saw brute force login attempts from the web server to the domain controller that were not successful, and CrowdStrike alerted to that behavior almost immediately when it started, which was great to have at our fingertips again. We had flow records that showed no evidence of exfiltration of large amounts of data, so great news, and we did not find any indications of lateral movement. This meant that basically the attackers got access to the web server and weren't able to go a lot further into the network from there, which is exactly what we were hoping we would find. Now, just as a quick timeout, this could have been a lot worse had we not had access to this data. We wouldn't have been able to necessarily determine whether or not this information had been stolen from their network, how far the attackers made it in, or at least we'd have a much more difficult time finding the information to back up those findings. In this case, this could have led to things like over-reporting. It could have led to fines, lawsuits, and reputational damage. And again, these are all things that we want to avoid. What really it kind of sticks out as the point to bring home from this one, though, is that setup of log collection needs to be done well in advance of a potential incident. So if you're not logging your information right now, you need to get on that as quickly as you possibly can, because if you're setting it up after an event takes place, you're really not doing yourself a lot of good until you're coming up to a follow-up cyber attack, which hopefully we don't end up with. So yeah, we want to set up log collection in advance on things like workstations, servers specifically, critical applications, any sensitive data repositories that we're working with, cloud storage, email systems, and anything else that we run into in the network. So major challenges that come up when we're implementing these systems in the first place are not these insurmountable hurdles that people sometimes feel like they might be. Challenges include things like incomplete coverage of our monitoring setup. Before we even begin to implement monitoring, we need to know what it is we're going to be looking for and where that data comes from. So we need an inventory of applications and sources of log data in the network, and then a plan for how we do that. We also want to look at improper logging configuration. Are we grabbing enough data from these sources? Are we grabbing too much data? That can lead to what we refer to as data bloat. And that's where you just overload your logging and monitoring system with just too much information. There are a lot of elements of logging data that's generated by equipment inside your network that realistically does not need to be retained for long periods of time. And it depends on the specific application or hardware you're using to make that determination, but it is definitely something that needs to be reviewed. We also run into a problem with alert fatigue. If we're alerting on too much or too many elements of the network, then that can lead us to miss critical alerts when they come through. And alert fatigue is real. I mean, if you don't set up your monitoring and your alerting correctly, your IT staff can start getting alerts for everything from somebody mistyping a password to somebody going to a website that may have been flagged months ago by an outside organization. We also want to consider where that log data is being stored. Are we keeping this on a server in-house, or are we going to decentralize this and move it up to a cloud solution for long-term retention and storage? These are, again, all things that need to be considered for both cost and efficiency inside of your network. All right, so moving into a last element here, we have a third and final case study. And if you've seen our logging and monitoring presentations before, we've talked about this case a little bit, but it's such a great example of why this is so important that I figured I had to toss it back in here. So this was a transportation organization that we were working with last year, and they had a series of accounts compromised inside of their Office 365 tenant by a phishing attack. The IT staff performed an initial investigation and came up with a determination that 17 individual accounts within their tenant had been compromised. Their insurance and their legal counsel at that point had asked for their IT staff to kind of back up those findings a little bit and provide them with a little bit of verification as to how they came to that conclusion. And unfortunately, the IT staff at that point was not able to do so because they were not trained investigators at that point. They were general IT staff, and this was not really something that's in their wheelhouse, which is understandable. It really shouldn't be. IT professionals are not security professionals, and vice versa. That's something that we need to keep in mind. The problem that we ran into here was that the IT staff did not actually save any of the log data they were using for their initial investigation. Their Office 365 tenant was primarily E3 as far as their licensing went, which meant they had 90 days of retention on the audit log data that was available inside of that cloud tenant. And LMG was given the case 94 days after we had that kind of that initial spat of malicious activity. So the initial compromised data was no longer available to us, or at least it was going to be a large hurdle to get that information back from Microsoft. And we only had screenshots of the audit data that were that was being used for these initial determinations. And unfortunately, screenshots are really not going to cut it when it comes to a full investigation. We need access to that full unadulterated log data. This brings up an interesting point, though. When we're talking about things like cloud services specifically, one thing we need to keep in mind is retention times of the log data. If we're going to store stuff in its native platform, we need to know how long it's actually going to be made available to us. So if we're talking about Office 365 in general, if we're talking about E3 licensing, which is about the most common we find out there, you have 90 days worth of audit log data. If you bump up to E5, you have 365 days worth of logging data. There's also a logging package you can get through Office 365 that will upgrade the level of logging that you have available, but it's roughly the same cost as upgrading to an E5 license, so we usually just recommend people go with that. If we're talking about Amazon Web Services, AWS comes with 0 logging right out of the box. Or if you decide to turn it on, you have unlimited logging. You can store logs for as long as you want to for a price. They get stored in S3 buckets, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. If we're talking about Dropbox, we have about 28 days for G Suite or Google Workspace, as it's known now. We have 180 days of logging for some elements of their log data, but only 30 days of logging retention for other elements. So it's going to depend on where you're looking in there. And then Slack is another example. Slack will log forever unless you tell it not to. So there's a big discrepancy between how logging for cloud services actually perform based on vendor. Definitely something you want to take a look at with your vendor specifically. Now, for Office 365 in general, we really want to talk about audit logging because this can be a primary source of information during an attack that can be incredibly helpful for an investigator. In fact, this can be the make or break when it comes to determining what happened inside of a business email compromise. And audit log data, luckily for us, is included with just about every level of licensing inside of Microsoft's Office 365 system. The only difference is going to be exactly which elements you get logged and how long those logs stay around. So the very first thing you want to do from your end is verify that it is turned on. Prior to 2020, this was not enabled by default. So IT professionals would have to go in and actually turn on monitoring and logging. Since 2020, any new Office 365 tenants have had this enabled by default if you get this through Microsoft directly. If you're going through a reseller like GoDaddy or Rackspace or Vendasta or one of those other resellers of Office 365, they may have audit logging turned off inside of their tenants, even for new distributions. We're not entirely sure why they do that. It's not necessarily a paid service or something that's going to be costly on Microsoft's end. I'm sure they have their reasons, but definitely something that you want to take a look at. We also want to point out that logs from before auditing is turned on are very, very difficult, if not impossible, to obtain from Microsoft, depending on how far back you're looking. So having this stuff available up front and having it pre-configured before an attack takes place, again, very, very essential. Activity information we get from Microsoft is comprehensive, though. So again, we'll use this as our example, but other cloud providers will provide you with similar information. We get things like the date and time, down to the second in some cases, when an action happened. We get the IP address of the logged in user when that action was undertaken. We get the user who was logged in at that point in time, and then we get the activity itself. So in this case, just the very top line, we can see our user Owen at hackmeinc.com logging in from that one specific IP address was able to create a mailbox item. And this can be, again, very useful in determining what happened inside a tenant. There's also custom retention policies. And again, we're using Office 365 for the example, but they are not the only the only offering that makes this available. But it allows you to specify by user or group individual activities that you want to maintain long term. So in this case, we have SharePoint file operations for one specific user, accessing files, copying files, and deleting files, and we can set the duration on that to up to 10 years inside of the O365 system. Again, if we know that this is an available feature for us and if we configure it ahead of time. These are all turned off by default, so take a look. The other thing we want to look at is data loss prevention systems. And this becomes especially important when we're dealing with things like cloud email and cloud storage. We want to know where our sensitive information sits, how it's being utilized, if it's encrypted at rest, if it's encrypted in transit, if it's encrypted while it's being used. And all of these things can be logged and can be monitored very closely using a data loss prevention system. A lot of the cloud services that are in use by most enterprise organizations have an element of this already in play. Whether or not it's turned on or not is a different story. So again, we want to make sure that people are actually looking for that. The other thing we want to look at is your compliance score inside of these systems. We want to make sure that the overall configuration settings are up to par with what we consider to be normal security defaults. And there are automated systems in a lot of these cloud systems that can tell you ahead of time whether or not your configuration is up to industry standard or if you're lacking in a couple of areas. So definitely something to watch out for. Okay, so going back to our investigation here, we went through and were able to pull out enough log data to come up with a significantly different conclusion than the IT staff that originally did the investigation. We were able to determine that only 9 of the accounts were actually compromised, not 17. So that was a big deal, just about having the amount of compromised accounts. And we were able to determine that 2 of the accounts never actually opened or interacted with the phishing emails that were sent out to them. And we were able to deconflict some of the strange login activity from the other members that were suspected of being phished at this point as logging in from a hotspot or a home computer. Again, we wouldn't have been able to do that without access to all of this log data. And it would have been a much bigger problem for us. We had no evidence of cloud document access either, and we were able to cut their total e-discovery by over 50 gigabytes of data. And if you've ever had to go through e-discovery before, 50 gigabytes is a substantial amount of data. That is a lot of money that goes out the door to have a professional firm go through and really closely analyze the contents of that information. So every gigabyte counts at that point. We also want to be able to keep an eye on our team. And this is why we're kind of digging into this right at the end of the presentation. We've moved to a lot of cloud-based services over the last 2 years, and that should be no surprise to anyone who's on the call today. I'm sure we've all had to deal with it in one form or another. But understanding what's going on with those services becomes a little bit difficult, especially since a lot of the information about user activity is not readily available, or at least not right at our fingertips when we need it. So we want to be able to set up logging ahead of time to, one, verify that we are compliant with any of our contractual requirements or any of our regulatory requirements. And we also want to look at insider risks, things that happen inside of our network that are not necessarily malicious, but are no doubt just as detrimental as a malware infection on the network. The other reason we want to have this level of visibility into our cloud services and the pieces of infrastructure that we're looking at is phishing. Phishing has become, well, it has been for a while, but it's become a much bigger problem over the last couple of years, mainly because of the move to these cloud services. In fact, Q1 of 2022 showed an all-time high in the number of phishing attacks that were executed against worldwide organizations. 25% of those attacks targeted the financial sector directly. 80% of those attacks used free webmail accounts, while 60% of those free webmail accounts were Gmail specifically. 59% of phishing is credential theft oriented, which makes sense, and 30% of phishing websites exist for less than 24 hours. So having that proper logging and monitoring in place ahead of time to identify when we see a phishing email come in, who clicked it, where they went, and what those websites look like, and being able to do that rapidly is essential to being able to stop an attack from becoming much more widespread than a single user. We also want to look at the effectiveness of phishing campaigns, because this is becoming a lot more in depth as far as the level of detail of phishing goes. Where we're used to seeing phishing emails that are, hey, take a look at this document, and just including a Word document. Those are still prevalent and they're still out there, but they are not the most effective form of phishing that we're seeing. In fact, for organizations that are being directly targeted by phishing, we see the inclusion of vishing or voice phishing as a major element to consider. This is a report from IBM's exports that shows exactly how much more effective those kind of phishing campaigns can be. Click rate for average targeted phishing campaigns is 17.8%, so right about 1 in 5 users. When they add a voice phishing component or a follow-up to that, that bumps to 53% of victims. So again, having visibility into what's happening in those cloud systems is essential. We also want to look at things like where we're storing our data and where our virtual networks are residing in a lot of cases. So we'll take Amazon Web Services as an example. Again, this is not the only provider out there that functions this way, but they provide some good elemental discussion here. So Amazon has a few features built in that you can use for tracking and logging information about what's happening in your tenant. CloudWatch and CloudTrail are two of the most commonly identified solutions to this problem, but they're not free, and that's something that we need to keep in mind. When we turn these systems on, which is very easy to do, it does potentially generate additional charges for our organization, mainly because all of the data that's pulled back from the logging and monitoring that's taking place inside of AWS needs to be stored somewhere. And in the case of CloudWatch, that gets stored inside of an S3 bucket. Now, they warn you ahead of time. This is not a surprise. They tell you exactly what is going to be happening here, that this may present additional charges inside of your environment. But again, it's something that we need to watch out for. There are also some automated monitoring tools inside of AWS that can be used to alert us if something strange is going on. One of the big ones that we've seen as a newer offering is Amazon Detective. And Amazon Detective takes things like your CloudTrail logs, and VPC flow logs and your guard duty findings, puts them all into one conglomerated space and provides you with access and alerting based on that. Really nice system to have in place, although it will cost you money to analyze that data. So the first 0 to 1,000 gigabytes comes out to about $2 a gigabyte, and then it goes down in price from there. But if you have a lot of data that you're sifting through, this can become kind of expensive pretty quickly. So we want to make sure we're accounting for that ahead of time. There's also automated alerting just based on regular thresholds inside of the tenant as a whole. So if we're looking at things like usage of our virtual machines, if we're looking at usage of S3 buckets, the amount of data that's moving back and forth, a lot of other metrics like that, we can set automated alerting thresholds just internally and have them basically just alert us if something bad is going on. So one of the ones that we see used very popularly for things like domain controllers, if we understand what the normal usage of that system looks like, we can set up a threshold that if it's voided or violated, will automatically alert us that something strange is going on that we need to look in a little bit further. Very easy to set up. There's not really an additional cost for these things. You just need to have them configured ahead of time. All right, so the last thing that we want to talk about here is where log data is stored. So we're looking at log data from multiple sources: perimeter devices, hardware inside your network, local computer systems, cloud computers. There's a lot of other information that needs to be kind of accounted for here, and ideally we'll be able to put this all in one place. Now, centralizing your logging is, again, one of those things that you need to plan out a little bit ahead of time just so you understand what that's going to look like. But eventually, this has got to be your goal for your overall monitoring configuration. Make sure everything's in one spot, make sure it's actionable, that it's easily accessible, and that it's usable for your overall environment. We want to aggregate sources from as many places as possible inside of our network. We want this to be easy to access in an emergency, which is why we recommend looking at cloud storage in a lot of cases. We want correlation between those log sources. We want to be able to facilitate investigations, reduce costs and damages, and again, everything needs to be together. Now, if you're looking at the cost of implementing a system like this, having that visualization available to you, having overall storage available to you, there is good news. And we do get questions about this fairly frequently. What are some lower cost solutions to centralized logging and monitoring? Because larger scale solutions like Sumo Logic, if you're putting a lot of information into them, can get fairly expensive. Well, the good news is open source solutions are available that will assist in a lot of these cases. And one of the big ones that we end up using very frequently for our single device spinoffs in our lab is the Elastic Stack. The Elastic Stack is a combination of 4 different programs, so Beats, Logstash, Elasticsearch, and Kibana. You'll also hear it called the Elk Stack in a lot of cases. But this can be very useful for taking large sets of disparate data, putting them all together into one singular place, and then being able to very quickly look at what kind of information is available, what kind of activity might be going on, and any anomalous behavior that we see. The faster access to data, we use Office 365 as the example for this. Access to Office 365 log data can be directly piped into our Kibana system, which again is running open source and can be either low cost or no cost, depending on how we have it put together. It can be used for a very quick analysis of what's happening inside of a particular user account or particular email tenant. And again, Office 365 is not the only element we can have here. There's a lot more, but this is our example. So in this case, we're looking at a user who we have running inside of, again, our Hack Me Inc. tenant, our favorite email tenant to beat up on. And this is a brute force attack that's taking place against one of the user accounts in there. We can see multiple incidents of user logon failed. We see the exact time and date that it's happening, the IP address that it's coming in from, and the exact error they're running into. Using this, we can make some security changes on our back end, stop attacks like this from being successful or from interrupting the general flow of data in and out of our network. And it's, again, very easy to see because we have it right there at our fingertips. There are other options available. So Splunk is a great option. This is a paid service in some cases, although there is a free tier. And there are direct add-ons that go for a lot of popular services. So for Dropbox, for Microsoft's Office 365, for Splunk, there are built-in connectors that can just be pointed towards those tenants and just start pulling information back over to you automatically. This also makes your data very easy to work with. Again, this is one of those things where if we're pulling in a ton of log data, that's great because we have the information, but it can be daunting or detrimental if we don't know how to actually access and analyze the data that we have available. It can also lead to missing very important elements of that data because we flat just don't see the little elements that we want to look at. So having these customized dashboards and these kind of preset toolkits available for us makes all of that a lot easier. So takeaways, first thing we want to do is conduct threat hunting as a portion of our overall security posture, and this relies heavily on your logging and monitoring configuration. If you don't have this information ahead of time, threat hunting becomes a lot more difficult to do. Not impossible, but a lot more difficult. We want to invest in our antivirus and endpoint detection software. Those need to be up to speed with current industry standards using a modern solution. Otherwise, we are going to run into problems where if an attacker does get into the network, they're likely going to be able to sidestep those older controls pretty easily. We want to set up our logging and collection in advance of an incident. We don't want to be doing this while a ransomware attack is happening. We want to have this months or years prior to us even getting into the initial stages of that attack. We want to assign responsibility for triage and response, understand who is responsible for actually taking care of those initial response steps, have an on-call process so we have availability for basically 24-hour access into that information if it's needed. We want to know default retention time so we know how often we should be saving data or how we are or how much data we're going to have available if we're leaving it in place in the cloud provider. And then we also want to centralize that logging data so that it's all available right there at our fingertips, easy to access, easy to use, easy to create those actionable data points out of, and we're not stressing out our IT and security staff by having them look in 40 different places when they could just be looking in one. Okay, so that's all I have. Again, my name is Matt Duran with LMG Security. If you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to reach out. I'd love to hear from you. You can get me at info@lmgsecurity.com, find us on Twitter, find us on LinkedIn. And again, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about those initial triage steps and how we can utilize this log data and have it set up ahead of time, check out our Cyber First Responder class, register by tomorrow for the July 28th version, or check in with us later on down the road. We run this every few months. And again, it's a very useful class to have at your fingertips. All right, so thank you so much, everyone. Again, my name is Matt Duran, security consultant with LMG Security. If you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to ask them. You can email me at mduran@lmgsecurity.com, follow us on Twitter, look me up on LinkedIn, and thank you again.